Good afternoon. My name is Lindsay Addington, and I work at the National Association for College Admission Counseling. We are going to do a deep dive, get our hands dirty in some ethical cases that face the field, face you as professionals. But before that, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the purpose that this document serves for the profession. As I've shared with many of the colleagues here this week, one of the things that is most inspiring is to be a part of a movement that really is looking to elevate and show respect for the work that we do, the work that college counselors and career counselors do. And a code of ethics, I think, is critical. If you look at any profession, any professional organization, there's a code of ethics underpinning that work. And it really lays down the standards of integrity and professionalism that guide what we do and provides the legitimacy that our profession deserves. And also serves the purpose of protecting students in this increasingly complex and ever-changing environment and the professionals that serve them. And so we are excited to have you with us this afternoon to kind of dig a little deeper and to explore some of these complex and gray areas. I think a code of ethics strives to put as many things as possible in kind of a black and white area, but we all know that many things within our day-to-day are gray. And so as a membership organization, which we'll go into a little bit, that bridges and connects the professionals that serve on both sides of his student's college-going journey, on the high school side and the college and university admission side, it is my pleasure to let John and Bridget briefly introduce themselves as representatives of each of those sides of the desk, as we like to say.
I'm the college counselor at Bridget Herrera at the American International School of Dhaka, Bangladesh. I'm in my third year there, and prior to that, I spent 30 years in Latin America.
And I am John Wilkerson. I'm the Assistant Vice President for International Services at Indiana University, and also serve as currently the Vice President for the Admissions Enrollment Practices Committee within the International Association for College Admissions Counseling.
Wonderful. So what is NACA? How many of you are familiar, or maybe saw me present yesterday and explain a little bit about us as an organization? So we are the professional organization for college admission professionals, founded in 1937. So for over 80 years, we've been working to kind of professionalize what is college counseling. And it was built on our code of ethics. So a group of college and university admission representatives and counselors got together, deciding that they needed some constructs in which to help them operate and support students. Our organization, as is IC3, is a way for professionals to come together, to learn from each other, and again, to support students in this process. And again, founded on our statement of principles of good practice, code of ethics, and professional practices. So quite the mouthful. It used to just be SPGP, and now it's SPGP CEPP. But as we'll talk about through the evolution of this document, the name got longer in this last iteration, but the document itself is a bit more user-friendly, a bit more straightforward. So we're excited to talk a bit more about that. And our focus is really on the high school, secondary to post-secondary at the undergraduate level.
Lindsay, if I could interject for just a second. Those of you who were at our session yesterday, we mentioned that today is going to be a deeper dive into the ethos behind this. So its evolution, how we got to where we came. So hopefully yesterday was a nice kind of precursor. Today you'll get to see a bit more about how to navigate what it is that we did.
Wonderful. So NACA members, 15,000 college admission professionals, 50 countries represented in our membership. And again, like I said, we are the bridge organization. So not often do you see an organization that has different sectors in a way. So for example, if you are familiar with ACAC role, a peer organization. They're just at the university level. So that is what is unique about NACAC, as we bridge the secondary and post-secondary level, and that's with school-based counselors, independent counselors, and transfer counselors. We have on the admission and enrollment side, professionals serving students in the recruitment and admission and retention function, as well as community-based organizations and other organizations that support students like Common App, like College Board, ACT, who all serve a function in helping students transition from secondary to post-secondary education. And I thought to bring this home, I worked with one of our longtime counselors who's an international counselor, talking about the importance of membership in an organization. And it ties really nicely with what we're talking about today in terms of ethics. And so I thought I'd just read a quote from him that he shared with me. He says, "Many counselors across the US and the world operate in what typically feels like outposts, single-person offices where they are the sole representative of what college counseling is or should be. NACAC has provided me with an invaluable framework of principles, support, and colleagues that have helped me represent my profession locally with knowledge and confidence that directly benefits my students. When advocating with our school's leadership and educating students and families, it is important to place what I do within the larger context. It is so critical that our work does not happen in a vacuum, but is tied to a much larger and well-established professional community based on the highest ethical standards." And so I hope that you can find value, whether or not you are a member or not of NACAC, or what we'll talk about, one of our affiliate organizations. You can have trust in the fact that there is a professional construct around what you do, and you can have certain expectations for the institutions and other professionals that you engage with based on this foundational document. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, kind of dissect a little bit further about who NACAC is and our strength in numbers of affiliate organizations.
How many counselors, school counselors, are in the audience now? Okay, a handful. Great. Well, consider NACAC sort of the mothership, right? There is this broad organization that Lindsay described, 15,000 people strong. And below that umbrella lies all these affiliates. They break it down into sort of more manageable groups of people geographically. You may have heard us mention before International ACAC, International Association of College and Admissions Counselors. That is the affiliate organization for all of us living outside of the US. And therefore, it is the organization who sort of is the watchdog for us and our issues. And quite honestly, whether you're a member or not, many of the institutions that your students apply to and that you might work with regularly, they may be members. And so they are following this code of ethics that Lindsay has referred to. So as you can see, there are 23 state and regional affiliate organizations, with International ACAC being one of them. We all share a common mission, and it is a comfort to know that there are so many people out there that we can turn to. I'm not intentionally plugging membership for International ACAC, but I can tell you that it is nice to have a forum where you can just throw something out there, and something that's puzzling to you or that you need a quick answer for, and somebody's going to get back to you, and usually with accurate information. And like I say, they are there to look out for the issues that our students and our offices are facing today. I'm on, for example, the ad hoc committee for testing for standardized testing. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of talk going on right now. We need to make sure that going forward, decisions made, for our students are ones that work on behalf of our students.
And I think John's now, again, one of those things that ties the affiliate to the national organization is their commitment to abide by and enforce the code of ethics. So John's going to share a bit about that.
And Lindsay, I think some have the code of ethics was distributed, right? So a few of you have it. If you don't, then share with a neighbor, I think.
There might be more. Let me check at the front.
Okay. This document, though, if you don't receive a copy today, is forward-facing on both the NACA website and on the International ACAC website as a PDF. So please download, share liberally. That would be fantastic. So those of you who are in our committee, or in our committee, it feels like that, right? In our session yesterday, got to see some cases, and we're going to do some more cases today that reference back to this. But this document, in its current form, is meant to not only be more clear and precise in its terminology, but I think that it's the transparency and navigation is the key here. And so as you peruse, I encouraged any of you who were with us yesterday to do this, and so I will encourage each of you as well. This is one of the few documents where I actually would read the preamble. It's interesting. I think it sets a very nice tone for what's contained within it, why we do what we do, why ethics matter, why this kind of equal playing field is of importance within our work. And ultimately, as Lindsay stated, that really has to do with student protection. So I think that if there was one term that I would use to describe this document, it would be student-centric. And so that is the focus. As you read through it, the hope is that when you have cases or situations, circumstances that you're unsure about, this can be your first kind of line of inquiry. It's very digestible. So as you go through it, I will caution you though, once you think you found, if you harken back to the opening speech about only looking at the first search page, oftentimes the topic that you may be investigating might be covered in a couple of sections. So it's worth perusing, kind of solidly to see how even if it's not apparent to you, how a certain circumstance or situation might play out longer term. And there might be other facets of that situation that warrant exploration and consideration. A key difference with this, so Lindsay mentioned the statement of principles of good practice, which really is just a very long way of saying establish best practice. It's just kind of what we do and what we ethically would come to, we hope, on our own. The tenets within this document should not be revelatory or we hope, oftentimes not contentious, as so long as you are exploring them from that student-centric perspective. So that is another piece of advice. Remove yourself from the read and act as though you were the student. And would this be of benefit to me? All provisions are now, aside from being just best practice, they are now mandatory for member organizations. So as we've mentioned, not every one of you is a member of NACAC nor International ACAC, but if you are working with an organization that is a member, or if you are a member, you are bound to behave within the parameters established by the CEPP. And Section 4 of this document now outlines very clearly what the ramifications of non-compliance are. There's a term that you'll see referenced in that section several times called voluntary resolution. That's a term that I think is important as well, because the intent of the document, again, is to codify ethical practices that we suspect most people would come to anyway. And so when some disagreement or a circumstance arises that warrants a little looking into, most of the time voluntary resolution is how that plays out, meaning it's brought to the attention of the parties involved and they agree, okay, this is probably what we should have done, now we understand, and we'll be compliant. But in cases where that does not happen, there are provisions now for further action. I think as international counselors, a very important thing for you to keep in mind, and I'll just skip forward to the next, is that as you do navigate this document, if a complaint, for example, if any of you were working with a university that was found to be doing practices that were possibly outside of SPGP, CEPP, that would be investigated by the member affiliate where that organization, where that potential offender is located. So for example, if a university in Michigan visited and something that the representative said didn't ring well, it would actually be the affiliate where the university in Michigan is located that would investigate and resolve that case. Conversely, if you're working with if you're working with an organization or a member university that's outside of the United States, that would be international ACAC. So that's a space where international ACAC and Lindsay and the NACAC team and all of the affiliates, there's a national committee that kind of comes together and navigates those areas where potentially multiple affiliates are involved. But I think that can be helpful to know as well. Questions about that before we move on?
I've got one. So if you're not a member, though, of International ACAC or NACA, you can still report.
Absolutely, and please do. It's a great question. We oftentimes will receive inquiries from non-members. For two reasons that's helpful. First of all, it's helpful to introduce them to this codified document of ethical best practice within the field, because again, it really is just best practice writ large. But secondly, that inquiry helps to inform international ACAC in our conversations with the National Association, so that if we do start to see practices that are going awry and widespread, we can address those in a very informed way. So we encourage outreach regardless of membership, and we will outreach or reach out on behalf of reporters, even to organizations or individuals who are not members of the association. It's a great question.
Can you share some examples of few of such?
I would say within, it doesn't happen frequently, but at least.
No, give us one or two examples that can.
Yeah. So two or three times a year, we will have a high school, perhaps a member high school, reach out to us and say that they've been approached by such and such organization. We take that inquiry, that complaint, into consideration. Oftentimes, or in those circumstances, we may find that that organization is not a member, but we will still reach out to that member.
Reach out and did what? What is the ethical?
Yeah, so the outreach is that we essentially tell them that a complaint has been filed.
I know. What is that complaint? It's something that I want to know. What grounds are they complaining?
Oh, well, we're going to get to those. We're going to do some case studies together. Yes, absolutely. But it's also a good question to preface those case studies, because we're going to go through a few today, but hopefully that kind of whets your appetite to go back and look at the CEPP in some detail, because odds are what we look at today, that's kind of just scratching the surface. As counselors, you've probably seen, hopefully not, but you've probably seen some practices that you might have looked at the CEPP and lodged a complaint. We'll also talk about how would you submit that inquiry. So you have segued perfectly into our next section.
And it remains confidential.
That's a very good point. All complaints, all inquiries, investigations, and outcomes remain completely confidential. So when a complaint is submitted, it comes to me first, and there's actually a three-party subcommittee within that admissions practices committee who triages the complaint first. It's completely confidential. If we decide that in looking at it, okay, this does warrant further investigation, we then take that to a 12-person admissions enrollment practices committee within International ACAC that has representation from universities, from high schools, from community-based organizations, and from 6 countries, including representation from India. So that's purposeful. We really want to make sure that we're having multiple perspectives examining this, not just within the context of CEPP, but also within, broad cultural and employment contexts and so forth. At that point, if the committee were to feel that there's a problem, that's when we would reach out to the offender, make them aware of the situation. 9 times out of 10, it's at that point that voluntary resolution occurs. They say, oh, I didn't know, wasn't aware of this, we will rectify it right away, and it's done. Now the key is, as Bridget mentioned with confidentiality, the committee will never know who the offender was nor the complainant. The only people who will know is that those 3 people who make the initial assessment. Beyond that, it becomes completely confidential. And if you were to submit an inquiry to the committee, part of our advice to you or our response to you would be, thank you so much. Please know that we will not be in touch again unless we request additional information. We refer to the sections of the CEPP that indicate we're not able to share outcomes, censures, things like that. Oftentimes, you'll know because the voluntary resolution usually is going to impact positively, hopefully, the students with whom you're working, but it is an important component of that process. Yes. Can individuals complain to NACA? There are two ways to do that. You can submit an inquiry directly to International ACAC or directly to NACA. There's a National Admissions Enrollment Practices Committee that our committee works with as part of one of the affiliates. Yeah. My advice would be start with International ACAC. We tend to know the field a little bit more. Not to say that the national certainly knows the field, but I think the level of specificity in terms of that cultural context and representation within our committee, I think can be really helpful to understand the nuances of what's happening. And then ultimately, even if it does get forwarded up to the national committee or to another regional affiliate, we are able to provide that context to them as they continue. It's a great question. Charlie.
Are there protections for the complainant in terms of confidentiality and the institution that may be explored for a possible violation?
There are. Neither will ever be disclosed by NACAC or by International ACAC. However, sometimes situations may be so specific, and that's actually part of the response in the complaint, that we do advise that this situation may only have affected your student and therefore you may be identified. But also the inquiry process initially it never sounds aggressive or punitive. The assumption of the committee is that they just didn't know. And so that's the approach. The approach is coaching and education, not punitive initially.
So
What happens later in terms of if there were censure or things like that? depending on the level of censure, and this is all outlined very clearly in Section 4, depending on the level of censure or how the adjudication plays out, we may not even know. If it goes up through the national committee, then it works through channels of leadership within NACAC, ultimately up to the CEO. The outcome of whatever censure or result happens is not disclosed even to the affiliate who reports.
I guess the limitation in punitive arrangements is that NACAC, if it's an organization or entity outside of our membership, the punishment is perhaps not being allowed to participate in our programs, not being allowed to participate in college fairs or conferences and such. So that may not be enough to change practice. So there are limitations on what the national organization can do.
And I think part of the part of that limitation is imposed by the fact that it's that we are a voluntary member organization. There are definitely benefits to being a member of NACAC, and I think it's less common that you find institutions in the U.S. who aren't. And some of those events are really kind of key professional events and recruiting events in the U.S. But as a voluntary membership, ultimately there's no kind of government force behind this or anything like that. It really is voluntary adherence to these codes as a member organization or individual.
While we're on this topic, do you want to just go to the next
Sure.
slide? We'll talk about kind of the value of the code to you all as both counselors and for the universities in the room, what benefit it has to, again, be part of an organization or to utilize a professional code of conduct that kind of governs what you do. And this ranges from being able to help you advocate to your school leadership to set certain policies, maybe around how you set up your high school profile, for example, how you advocate for grading. And then on the university side, what you can expect of universities that are members of NACAC and how they should be interacting and engaging with you and your students.
It's very helpful when you're sitting with students and parents as well, and they're talking about perhaps applying ED someplace, and then they bring in to the conversation, well, how about if I apply to a second one or something like that? And it's wonderful. Like, I don't even have to take it out and show them, but I can cite this code of ethics and say, I have to follow this, and therefore, I cannot allow you to do this. Records won't be sent, etc. It's really something great to use also with your administrator when it's necessary.
I think that's very similar. We do in the university realm quite a bit of benchmarking, right? I see university folks. We know our peer institutions. We know how we should behave and how best practices are established. And oftentimes best practice is established in consortium. We find those collegial networks where we mull around a situation and say, this is probably how we ought to behave. So, for example, Indiana University is part of the Big Ten Academic Alliance, which includes universities that look like us: Purdue, Michigan State, Iowa, Illinois, so forth. And we share best practice, policy, things like that, always with the focus on student mobility, access, mission, things like that. I think that this does the same thing on a much broader scale. It provides for us a framework to which we hold ourselves accountable. And that can be very helpful, especially, Ganesh made a very, I think, salient comment in his opening remarks about commodification of students. And so, particularly in the United States right now, I think paying attention to ethical guidelines and principles that are outlined in a document like this provides a fairly strong foundation from which we can advocate on behalf of students to provide consistent ethical behavior within our field and within our institutions.
So I think without further ado, we'll jump into some of the nitty gritty work which you're interested in and discuss some of the case studies. So this is going to require some smaller group conversations. I know the room isn't set up to facilitate that greatly, but we're going to do our best.
If you want to use that microphone, I can be
Yes,
Oprah Winfrey.
Yeah. So
Much less talented, much less wealthy.
as we go through this, you can kind of put yourself. So, John, as he shared, is the vice president of the Admission Practices Committee, which is that committee that provides the avenue through which complaints are processed and evaluated, and then outreach and education occurs. And so, we want you to put yourself in the role of someone on his committee as you kind of evaluate these situations.
And
So you're-
committee applications open in April. I encourage everyone to be involved.
What factors should be considered as we go through each of these cases? Is this compliant with the SPGP? And again, some of you have hard copies that you can, if you're interested in, dig deeper, but you can talk more broadly without going into the actual code. And then we'll discuss possibly some variations on these cases, because as we talked about there, these are examples and they can go many different directions, and they have gone many different directions. So we'll talk about that. So I think the first one Bridget's going to introduce.
Okay, and we will, after I read this, want you to get into small groups. So this is about the national candidates reply date, the very popular May 1st. A U.S. university is hosting a Beyonce concert on May 10 and notifies all admitted students that any student who has submitted enrollment confirmations and deposits by April 5th will be entered into a drawing to win a pair of tickets. Compliant?
Discuss.
So get in groups, because I've done this before and it's fun to see where the discussions go.
All right. I think we can bring this back. All right, let's talk lemonade. Did anybody get the Beyonce reference? Lemonade. Okay, thank you. All right. Our colleague. Yeah. Well, of course, our student volunteers get the reference. All right. So just show of hands, how many of you think that this is not compliant? All right. And so, okay, well, let's give us some. Tell us more. Tell us more. Why do you think that?
We thought it, in a way, it was incentivizing or bribing, if I could use that.
Right. Joan, what was your term? Bribing and
Baiting.
baiting. Okay.
Want to share your thoughts? Share
I felt that this is fixating the student to limit his option by paying early, and especially for Indian students, the major fear is, if I want to take a shift, what would happen to my money that I have already deposited? And even what if my admission is not even confirmed? I've just enrolled. So I think that was something that came to my mind from the parents' aspect. It's a big fear or insecurity by paying, by depositing, and it's a they are saying that they will have a lucky draw or something for tickets, and he might not get that also. So it can be a miserable state for a student and his family, probably.
This is a student who is very dedicated to their education and Beyonce, and there's a quandary. What do I do? Yes, I relate to that student. Joan.
So I think there are also consequences here that I don't know. Sometimes things happen and you don't even know that there are consequences that will happen. Like I can see a student loving Beyonce, depositing, withdrawing from their other schools, and then having no option if they don't get to go to Beyonce or the university doesn't come through. So I don't know. That's my catastrophic.
I think all of this, this introduces a level of unethical incentivization, but also another level of complexity and anxiety for a student. You know, it's unnecessary. Now let's ask, what if this had been a Canadian university? What then? Yeah. Well, you just became our expert. Oh, Canada.
We are actually seeing some of these deadline changes as a way to get students to commit to places maybe other than the US. So we are seeing some earlier deadlines in universities across Canada. Ours is always later than the US, so we have the opposite problem, but it wouldn't necessarily be a compliance problem at that point.
Well, I think that the issue there is that this SPGP CEPP, that May 1st deadline is specific to U.S. universities or U.S. universities who maintain campuses outside the states. So there is accommodation in SPGP CEPP for very, I know, I've had some practice. But there is accommodation for differing admission cycles in each country. And so especially within our association, those of you who are working with students who are applying, hopefully, to an increasingly wide range of universities globally, that's a section I think that's very important to familiarize yourself with and understand that, and also help to set those expectations, as Bridget said, with parents and students as they go into this process, because oftentimes they will be, you know, it's the students that are going to be receiving those communications first, we hope, unless it's the parent who's put their email address on the application, because that never happens.
So here's also another instance where it's about the intent and spirit, right? So if the Canadian university had said, our deadline is April 5th, and that was clear in all the materials, there wouldn't be an issue with requiring deposit by April 5th. So it just, these are some of those nuances. May 1st is that national candidates reply date in the US, but then there are room for flexibility with other countries.
I still would say, how many of you, regardless, think that there is an ick factor? Like, ugh. Ick, like it makes you go,
I think students are far too rational to make. I don't also identify what's right for them, what's wrong. So I don't think of Beyonce would just then. I think they can buy a ticket and go for a Beyonce show rather than lose a $500. You know?
well, that's what we hope. Yeah, that's what we hope. But I think also from the university perspective in this scenario, I always revert to something that my mom said to me every night before I'd go out on the weekend: avoid the appearance of evil. Doesn't even matter if you're not the participant. Don't give anybody an opportunity to associate you with something that was ick. So, okay. Yes, another comment.
I had a question. So in such a case, okay, that's different. I know of a university, and this was a while ago, who had, I don't know whether they followed through with it or not, but they were planning on bringing students to campus up to, I think it was kind of like up to 2 to 3 students on campus who've been admitted, but not deposit paid. But if they pay, but it was a very, is it?
So I think there are a lot of grades in this, starting from a free ticket to go to the US and campus and back. I don't want to name the colleges here, but also
The fact that the universities have yield receptions, and trust me, because I was in EduS, I know that, and giving a goodies like anything from, what do you call those, hats and caps and all sort of stuffs, the goodies, and you see these kids posing on all over social media with those, you know, even the Ivy Leagues or non-Ivy Leagues or big conference or whatever. So I think there are different grades of this, right?
Yeah, and I think also in that situation that you do have to be a little bit careful, because some of those fly-ins for students are for full need scholarships or for talent-based. So there's a lot to unpack there. So, you know, I think always asking the question is appropriate, but also if we're thinking in terms of even playing fields, those yield receptions are, you know, that's part of the US experience too. And so when we come abroad, we're basically bringing to you a program that the student wouldn't have access to otherwise. So, and there are some limitations as to what can happen in those as well. And that's outlined in SPGP as well. Great.
Great. So we're going to move on to case study 2.
Is this me? Okay.
Sure.
Sure. All right. It's mid-April, and it's the best time of year. And your student has been admitted to several excellent U.S. universities, but has a conditional offer from the UK that he wants to pursue. As a counselor, how would you advise the student? What if the student wants to double deposit in the U.S.? Because remember, May 1st, deposit deadline in the States. As an admissions officer, what would you expect? And just to be sure that we're clear, students often can deposit after May 1st, but the deposit is no longer refundable. So it becomes, there's a financial commitment. And oftentimes, depending on the selectivity of the university, they may or may not lose their seat as well. So there's a lot tied to that May 1st deadline. All right, so discuss. Yes, oh, yeah, all right. So we've had I've heard great commentary. I've heard a lot of you just talk yourselves right into all kinds of problems with this, because there are a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different ways that this can go. So conditional offer from the UK that he wants to pursue. I think I want to start with the question that's coming out over here. What does double deposit mean? So this says, what if the student wants to double deposit in the United States? So let's unpack that first. Is that appropriate? No. All right. So one down. Student can't double deposit in the US, but...
Yet our group discussed how many students do.
Oh, and this is a very important point. What this document cannot do is govern or police the actions of 17-year-olds.
Or their parents.
Or their parents. It can provide to everyone who's providing advice, aside from parents, etc., in that space. For us, it can provide guidance and regulations. But ultimately, all our responsibility ends at we have advised, or not supported, or...
We had a similar conversation. She said, what if the student does it? And, I had no knowledge. And I said, at the end of the day, though, you can say, I will send the final transcript to only one school.
Yeah, which we heard over here as well. So this sounds like a practice that is fairly known. But then, okay, so we know one in the US, but where does that leave our UK deposit?
Yeah.
Is there a deposit for a conditional offer?
No.
Oh, no, not for conditional.
No, I mean, we say deposit, but,
It's a housing deposit. It's not a
And
but
that- even
but
that's
it's
limited,
still,
yeah.
you're keeping the offer open,
Yeah.
let's say.
Yeah.
Right? Where the student is choosing it as a firm, you're choosing your firm and insurance, and it's there.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, Bridget, what would you do in this case?
Well, obviously, no double deposit if they ask me, and they sure better. Of course, that's a big no-no, but keeping the other open, yes. I mean, it is really tough for the kids when you are reliant on the scores that you get on IBs or A level. You've got to give yourself some options anymore, because anything can go wrong that testing week.
So remembering what Lindsay said about honoring the spirit and the intent of this document, if we think about why that May 1st deadline was established, it was to ensure that students in a very US-centric construction had sufficient time to consider all of their admissions officers. Well, hopefully they've already done that, but consider their admission offers in very thoughtful ways so that they make an informed decision. That's the spirit and the intent.
And that a student has an option at the end of the day when it's all said and done.
Right. So in this case, it is appropriate because were it not, we would be eliminating a potentially better fit for that student in their decisioning. Now, we had a good conversation about as a counselor, or as a U.S. university officer, what about advising the student to ask the university if they can extend the deadline for deposit? That is always appropriate. I told this group that was something that my dad taught me was it's free to ask, make them tell you no. So that's words of wisdom from John's parents all day long.
John?
Yes.
John, and for the U.S. institution where you deposit, is it a good idea to let them know that, yes, I'm depositing here, but I also am holding an offer in another country?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we talked about that as well, and that's where the extension conversation came up. They would prefer that the student not deposit and tell, but rather tell and then have an extension granted. So again, it's case by case, but have that conversation at your institution.
This year we had a situation where the student, where this girl had applied to Brown, a very bright girl, and she was interested in doing medicine. And she had asked for if not medicine, a particular course at Brown, and she had applied to Oxford. And Oxford for medicine is like the tops, and naturally their results come out much later. So she wrote to Brown, and they gave her an admission offer, but like related field, I think, if I recall correctly, it was major in chemistry or biology, with a minor in one of them. I don't recall so much because I'm the head of school, so the counselor would know the details. But I do know there was a conflict of interest. And then she got an offer much later from Oxford for medicine, because once the IB results were out, she's an IB student, and then that's how it happened. So then, because the course was not on offer, she chose, I mean, the course of her choice or subject was not the first option she got at Brown. She went to Oxford. But then it's appropriate as a school that we write to Brown saying that we are sorry, but this is the situation, and it's okay to apologize, because they are children at the end of the day, and they do also have a lot of parental pressure.
Right.
Because if you were to ask the girl separately, she might say, Brown would be better. I want to go to the States. But then that's how it is. Yeah.
Right. And I think speaking
and
for
knowing
John,
Brown's admissions office, I would be shocked if they weren't very gracious and
Yes.
thankful. Yeah,
appreciative of that.
absolutely appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah. And we also talked about the counselor's responsibility in informing students of how they should act and notifying schools if you're not selecting them, if you selected another institution. We are short on time, so I want to do a choose your own adventure for our last, I think, 9 minutes. So we have a case study on waitlist, we have a case study on agents, or we're happy to hear one of your cases and talk through that as a group. So show of hands for waitlist, show of hands for agents, show of hands for your own complex case.
Agents, all right.
All right. A counselor at a high school located outside the U.S. is contacted by an agent requesting to schedule a visit. Mr. Agent asserts that he is an official representative of a United States university. The counselor cannot confirm this relationship on the university's website, but through a phone call to the university, it is confirmed that the agent does represent them abroad. Is this compliant?
I think we can discuss this one as a group. I saw some quick reactions. So who says it is not? All right. Here and then.
So if my understanding of SPGP is correct, in order for an agent to be representative of a United States university, there has to be clear, transparent documentation and publications throughout all of their medias that an agent is working for them. So not only on print media, but on social media, on websites, phone calls, etc.
A profile which says that their name is on it.
So if it had been on the school brochure or
the college brochure, I might just, then I would accept that he is one of them.
Other thoughts?
For the US, for US high school students, is that compliant?
Meaning had this happened in the
United States, and they are let's say that I'm a university in Missouri, and you have a representative, and I have a representative in Miami, and I'm Mr. Agent in Miami. Is that
Question. Great question. So this is where you are differentiating between an employee of the institution who would be a regional representative, which is completely appropriate, versus someone who is not an employee of the university but is receiving some type of financial incentive for acting on their behalf. So that would be the distinction.
because I think one of the things that so in the corporate world, there are certain things that you cannot do in the US that was okay to do in different countries, and then they got caught for it. I have a feeling, and I'm starting to learn a lot more about NACAC and the Code of Principles, and there are certain things that are not allowed for US students, but is allowed for international students, and I'm not okay with that.
You are not alone. The Higher Education Act is what you're referring to in the United States, which is a law that prohibits the use of commission-based agents in the recruitment of U.S. citizens. Does not matter where they're located.
And
So
that's
interesting.
tied to Title IV federal financial
Right.
funding.
Right. And it was, as we've said, it's best to consider this always from the lens of a student protection. That Title IV, that Higher Education Act, all of that was really a result of consumer protections that needed to happen.
Now, another nuance to that is, what if there is an international student at a U.S. high school? Are they eligible to be recruited by a commission-based agent? An international student at a U.S. high school, are they eligible to be recruited by a commission-based agent? NACAC advises no. However, different legal advice from different universities varies, but whether or not, according to the federal regulation, whether or not that's admissible or acceptable or not.
So you tell that university to call me and I'll give them an opinion.
What about our own high school alumni at universities? In those countries who might work as agents, who might come back to school and say, I can help you out with the admission, and I'm working for the university, and I am in the admission team, and things like that. So, I mean, alumni, our own school alumni working as an agent for representing his own university where he studied, or are being paid for it also.
So I think that's the distinction. If they're being paid. So I'll tell you, we have a program called the Hometown Hoosiers that we're called the Hoosiers. So there you go. Nobody knows what it is. If you can figure it out, you get a scholarship. But the Hometown Hoosiers program is designed for students who are enrolled at our university, who are going home over breaks or whatnot, to go and talk about their university experience. And I will say the difference for us is we don't care if they're talking about Indiana. In fact, we prefer that they wouldn't. We want them there talking about what was the application process like for them, how did they look at universities, things like that. So it's nuanced, but I think that the point of distinction you made was if the student was being paid per head, that becomes an agent relationship. If they're, I'll be honest, if this complaint were sent to our committee, we would talk about it. How about that?
I think it's difficult too if it's an alumni. Your school leadership might be very excited to have them back on campus as well to talk with kids, but I'm always reluctant. The one thing I would do, if your leadership says, oh, they're coming on, I would say that's fine. But first, they're going to sit down and talk with me about what they plan to say to the students, because even though, like I mentioned in yesterday's session, even though somebody got into a university and studied there, it doesn't mean they know all the nuances of the application process and how to get in.
Very good point. And the students that are doing outreach, whether it's most universities will have a global ambassador program or an international student ambassador program, but those conversations should really be focused not so much on the application, should be focused again more on what's the university experience like. And intentionally, admissions officers are usually not in the room when that happens. We don't want to be. Yeah, that's different. Yeah, yeah. So I think you have found a gray spot where you'd need to dig into it a little bit more and find out what's the intent. Always, if there's a question, reach out to the university admissions office where that individual says they have an affiliation and vet that with them, because we may not know that someone is showing up.
So, but suppose someone says I'm a university representative. Is that different from the agent bit, right? University representative. That designation.
Well, I would
Yeah,
argue
that means
there-
that you're a part of that university. You are being you're employed by that university. Doesn't that mean that?
I think we can't take that
I just want to
on the
understand.
surface. I think
It should, but
agents represent themselves in different capacities using different terminology, whatever's going to suit them
Ooh, we
best
found a
in the
topic.
process. And being a representative of a university is technically what an agent is doing. But I think it might convey something differently as it might have to you to say you're a university representative. It implies certain things that shouldn't be taken for granted.
I'll tell you, because earlier when I was the IP coordinator and we just started with the IP program, we used to get people as agents and university representatives.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that.
They were like, and then when we had university admissions officers visiting us, they would say, don't go to agents. So, you know, that sort of a thing.
Right. Well, and I will
How-
state that the part of this new code, which isn't yet in enforcement, but will be, it requires universities to list their agent partners. And so that provides you as a counselor, provides students an opportunity to verify that official relationship. And with that transparency, it's also on the onus of the institutions to ensure that their agents are working ethically. There's a lot that we require of institutions who do work with agents now. So
So also as a representative, you can represent 5 universities or more in a state, but as an agent, I think you won't be,
no, as an employee, as an official employee of a university, you represent only that university. But there are varying agent contracts, and so yeah, you might find an agent or an agent organization that represents multiple schools. Yeah, regardless, each of those 5 universities should be disclosing that agent relationship on their website so
And-
that you know and students know.
one last question. Yeah.
So I you're talking a lot largely about agents, but I also have heard of cases where school counselors get kickbacks for associating with universities. One, and then there's also the another area where you have private premium counselors who also tie up with universities, but they don't take money from. They don't get a kickback from the university, but they do have certain, certain connections. So how do you categorize this? Again, it's compliance and non-compliance. I mean, I know
Reportable,
of school
yes.
counselors who directed students to certain universities.
As a concluding thought, right? We know through our discussions today, there's a lot of gray area, right? I think as John explained, this is an opportunity to educate, to have a dialogue around ethics. It's not always clear cut. If you have a question, even if you don't think it's a violation, but have a question, it has that ick factor, send an email. It prompts discussion both at an affiliate and a national level that helps to advance the field ultimately, as it may get codified later in the process. So please engage. Please be respectful of our peers and professionals here looking to serve students, and let's continue this dialogue. So thank you for being with us today. And I think it's coffee break and then our closing session. So.